How many seemingly strange things happened before it? Morgan Robertson's book Futility, published in 1898, 14 years, before. You can see a ship sinking against an iceberg. Now, I mean, all ships in those days looked a bit the same. That one only has 3 funnels, but it does look a bit like her. That ship was a brand new ship. It's a fictional story of a ship that was brand spanking new on her maiden voyage with all the best well-heeled people in the world going on board, and struck an iceberg and sank, and there weren't enough lifeboats. The ship was called the Titan. That one's a real story. I've seen somebody try to debunk it, but there isn't. I mean, we've got the 1898 copies. It's real. It seems like that name is not a very good name. Many of us know about the Titan submersible that imploded about 600 yards off of the bow of the Titanic wreck. Of course, needless to say, taken all on board. When they named it Titan, I thought, yeah. I wouldn't have. That's all I can say. And here's another one. Are these things coincidence or not? This is another one. It checks out. This is a poem called Victoria by Arthur T. Clarke Couch in 1893. Thus she, the stricken hull, the doomed, the beautiful, proudly to her fate abased her brow, Titanic. That's a legitimate poem. It does seem like this was... Well, I wouldn't get on any submersible called the Titan, that's all I can say. And of course, the Greek mythological legend of the Titans is that they were destroyed for their hubris. Here's another one, American Airlines Flight 191, 1979, Chicago O'Hare. Anybody remember the Bionic Woman? The actress Lindsay Wagner, who played Bionic Woman, was on that flight. And at the last minute, she begged to be let off. She just could not shake this sense of dread. And I think rather reluctantly, they let her off, probably because of her celebrity status. And that's actually a real picture of her just before she crashed, taken by a plane spotter, and that's the actual explosion. It looks like it's right next to the building. It's actually in a field a few acres away. That field, police still to this day get reports of, there's a bunch of kids with flashlights screaming and yelling in the field, and the police may only be a little ways away, pardon me, and needless to say, find nothing's there. Flight 191s, if I want to get out of somewhere and it's a Flight 191, I want to get out of there real bad. It does seem to be something about numbers. Aeroflot in Russia, 1963, Flight 191, 12 dead. An X-15 test flight, the sole occupant pilot died, 1967, 1972, Premier 191, 25 on board, 5 dead. The one we just mentioned, American from O'Hare, a terrible 273. Delta Flight 191, 1985, 137. Comair 191, 2006, 49 dead. And a less dramatic JetBlue in 2012 diverted due to pilot error. But there just seems to be something about that flight number. Very few airlines will use it. Rather like the name Waratah. Waratah is a flower. It's a national flower of Scotland. And this is a ship launched, she was built in 1907 to 08 in Scotland. She had a successful maiden voyage from the UK down through the Cape of Good Hope to Australia and then back up. And no problems at all. Second voyage, one passenger disembarked at Durban in South Africa, and he telegraphed his family saying he found her top heavy. Another passenger also got out at Durban, and he said he had a nightmare of a kind of dark Neptune figure rising up from the waves, holding a blood-stained sheet, spit it out here, screaming the Waratah over and over again. And he very wisely decided to disembark. We do not know what happened to the Waratah. Her wreck has never been found. Obviously, all hands were lost. Ships called the Waratah, 1848, lost all hands, English Channel. 1887, lost all hands on voyage to Sydney. Just south of Sydney, also in the 1880s, we don't know the year, another one. 1897, one lost off the Gulf of Carpentaria, and of course the one we just mentioned in 1909. It's been retired as a ship's name. Now, I mean, you get ships called Golden Hind, for instance. There were quite a lot of Golden Hinds, one or two of them sunk. But not all of them. Waratah just seems to be a very unfortunate name. And it does seem to run that way. Let's get back to New Ross. We're talking about the late 1960s here. There was a guy who jumped out of his bed. and he was shouting curses. And his wife said to him, well, what's the matter? What's going on? He said, didn't you hear that? He said, I didn't hear anything. Didn't you hear the knocks? He heard the infamous 3 knocks thing, which seems, once again, that seems to run through different cultures. It's not unique to any one culture or faith background, and although it's more prevalent in ours. But he was convinced somebody was going to die. He said, somebody's going to die. He was quite scared of going to work that morning. He was that convinced. It was a certainty for him. And it actually was his wife who discovered the issues that next morning about 8 a.m. She saw the next door neighbor, who was a young bride, literally running around the garden with her hands to her head screaming, and their 18-month-old daughter had suffered a crib death. And when he came back that night, the gentleman who had the premonition, he wasn't at all surprised that this had happened, but his only surprise was that it wasn't somebody a little more closely related to him. And he had the idea it was going to be a very near relative. The child was actually a very distant relative. And it does seem to run in families that way. We're going to come right back to him and his family very briefly. But my mother, when she lost her first, the sister we never knew, who died in, I think, 1956, Mum called my grandmother up to tell her. And Gran said, no, I already knew. Gran had that. Gran used to be in the Girls' Land Army in the Second World War. She loved working in her garden, and she claimed that a bird had perched on her shovel and told her. She never said whether the bird spoke or whether it just was an osmosis thing, but Gran knew. From the bird somehow conveyed the message to her. Gran wasn't at all surprised or upset, and it should have been, the first baby should have been a wonderful thing. Gran wasn't at all surprised. The gentleman on the Mill Road had that. The same gentleman had the premonition of the little girl next door. His grandfather was on his deathbed, and he kept screaming to the family, get Bobby out of my bed, get Bobby out of my bed, over and over again. And the family figured maybe it was a kind of dementia or hallucination he was having. He passed away. It was only about a week after the old gentleman passed that a young family member of that name died in an accident. It was like they were literally in the same deathbed together, in a spiritual sense. One lady who worked had that when she went to a tarot card reader in Mahone Bay in the 1980s, who said to her, I can see your husband works in heavy equipment. And how you find that from tarot cards, I'll never know, because I know a little about them. But anyway, she did. And he said, you should warn him to be careful. Well, as most of us here know, poor had an accident with a tractor, which he did survive, but he was crippled, and it certainly shortened his life. How that fortune teller lady was able to do that, I don't know. One story I had, and passed away. He appeared before Nancy apparently, and said to her, "Look after her." Look after his wife. Her mother-in-law. After he passed, and it wasn't at all scary. He just appeared in the doorway and just asked us, and peacefully went off to his, God rest him, off to his next life. One woman on the Littleville Road, they were an older couple, about halfway up Littleville Road, I believe it was. And she was just working around in the kitchen when she heard a knock on the door, and looking through a little window in the door, saw it was her husband, and wondering why he would knock, because maybe she just assumed he had an armful of firewood or something like that, went to let him in, and suddenly remembered that he was asleep in the bed in the other room. And you guessed it, the old gentleman had passed away. He was just coming in to say goodbye. And this is one of the other more interesting ones from around here. Most of us know where the Hill Daniel Brown house is. Up there at the end of the Forties Road. It's currently for sale. I've drunk many a good cup of tea in that house. I've never had any paranormal experiences there. But anyway, a group were having a lovely evening there, about 3 or 4 couples, and everything went great. One of the couples was from the Chester Grant area, down by where the sharp turns are. And they complained, well, they weren't exactly complaining, but just talking about how neighbors had said they would see an apparition in their garden. This is down in Chester Grant. And everybody's like, well, that's interesting, and the conversation just moved on. One of the group was an amateur photographer, took a photograph of them, and a couple of weeks later called up, and apparently he saw the image of this guy they were talking about in Chester Grant. The lady who told me the story said, surrounded by a kind of holy haze, is a lovely way of putting it. and she hoped to get me a copy of the photograph, but unfortunately we weren't able to. If I ever do, I'll definitely send it down. But this is an apparition that appeared down in Chester Grant, which apparently decided to just hop in the car and have a pleasant soiree up in the 40s before presumably going back down to Chester Grant. So there are actually stories of movable spirits. If you get into especially Yorkshire folklore in England and Lancashire, movable spirits. Some of them will follow a family. They'll just be with a certain family. The family will move to another place and they'll follow along. Big part of Lancashire folklore, that one. Now there's, oops, I'll get to that one later. I'm going ahead of myself here. House down by the fairgrounds is an interesting one. I don't think people living in that particular place now have had any experiences, but a lady who lived there told me of 3 incidents in this house. And I mentioned earlier how some people seem to have that happen and others don't. Her daughter lived in the same house, no issues at all. But this lady lived there, and a guest who was staying in his bedroom that night, one night, woke up and he had a kind of bodily paralysis. He couldn't move, and as he woke up, he saw an apparition at the end of his bed with a top hat on and dressed very 19th century, and it could speak. It was fairly opaque. And it asked him to follow him. I've got something to show you. And the man, as he began to shake the paralysis off and was able to move, the apparition just dissipated in front of him. And interestingly, he was quite upset about that. He actually wanted to go with this figure and see where it was leading him. I wouldn't myself, but that's okay. But another guest about 8 o'clock in the evening saw the very same apparition in the kitchen and was so upset that he left immediately. And so it is interesting. It's not the actual person themselves who's seeing this. We've got 2 different people seeing it. And she actually did not see the apparition, but she woke up in bed one night with that same sense of bodily paralysis. And she described it as like a hurricane, a noise of wind blowing like a hurricane, coming from a piece of furniture, of all things. And she was quite devout, and she prayed. And gradually, as she prayed, the manifestations calmed down. Getting into buildings, though, are certain types of buildings more likely to be haunted? Hotels are notorious for it. People do die in hotels, but people die in all kinds of buildings and don't manifest any phenomena. Cruise ships are unbelievable. Just Google them. It's incredible. Yep. Cruise ships are notorious for that. No surprise, mass occupation buildings like hospitals, residential schools, orphanages, prisons, and especially insane asylums are notoriously prone for paranormal activity. And parapsychologists believe, with the case of asylums, rather like with theaters, they're both places where people, the dividing line between fantasy and reality has been accidentally in one case and deliberately in another. It's been thinned. People, they're deliberately warping the fabric of reality. You go to a good theatrical performance, if it's good, reality's changed for you, and that's one of the guesses they make as to why theaters may be haunted. Lighthouses, I actually talked to Canada's last active lighthouse keeper, who's a dear friend I've known since junior high school, and he actually gave me so much information I could do a talk just on that. I can't do what he gave me justice, so maybe we can do that next year. But he never had anything happen to him. But he did say many of the old keepers he knew had all kinds of stories. Are certain parts of a building more likely to be haunted? Yes. When you go through ghost stories, it seems that things like, can't read my own writing or typing here, living rooms and porches are a little less likely to be haunted than kitchens or bedrooms. And the most likely areas to have paranormal activity are corridors and bedrooms, and especially staircases. Actually, bedrooms are in the middle one there, but yeah, corridors, but staircases, perhaps because they're the most common place for fatal accidents to happen in a home, who knows. But certainly, they tend to happen more often. Are there different types of ghosts? Yes. Somebody said that there was somebody curious about the idea of a ghost floating off of the air, and why, up in the air. Why does that tend to happen? Parapsychologists and people who study ghost lore as well as folklore say that there seem to be different types of ghosts. These aren't my I didn't make these definitions. The first is what they call an astral corpse, and that's the kind you're going to have floating in the air. And that's the kind of ghost, you get your classic ghost story that the spirit of old Jed Brown comes up here and he walks down to his workshop and he disappears. I just made him up, but it's a classic example of that kind of thing. A good example of an astral corpse ghost that was reported is in a hospital in England. She was a nurse who died very peacefully after living a long life, helping many, many people, God rest her. She did not have anything dramatic happen in her life, but people will report seeing this nurse wheeling a tray of hospital supplies up a corridor. She goes through a wall because the wall wasn't there when she was alive and just dissipates. Gradually, people who research these things, who believe in them, say it's leftover energy, and gradually these things do tend to dissipate. They're quite harmless, they're not intelligent in any way. The only way something like that's likely to cause a harm is if you're operating equipment or machinery or a motor vehicle and you're spooked by them, but they're not likely to cause any harm themselves. The discarnate entity is, that's a term I use, but the basic definition is real. Oh, and I forgot to mention, why would a ghost float over the road? Because I got sidetracked there. Usually what happens, there was one of a cyclist who was killed in Britain in an accident about in the 1930s, and people will still see this figure on a bicycle come along and then disappear where the accident took place. He seems to ride about 3 feet up in the air. That's because the road was lowered in the 1950s to make the road safer. And they do seem to work that way, like the spirit of the ghost going through the wall because the wall wasn't there. They are kind of where things used to be. And we've got a pirate in the back there. And or talk about an apparition that somebody saw in the Oak Island area when they were teenagers, a bunch of young guys, about 15, 18 years old. They all saw an apparition rather similar to the rather creepy-looking gentleman behind us there. Yeah. They saw this pirate, and same thing, he was standing about 2 or 3 feet in the air, and most likely the swamp has sunk a little bit from those times. And that seems to be, it's like the energy is just locked in place from where it used to be. This figure didn't speak. He was almost opaque. They could see his eyes. And then they, being young fellas, and it's 2 in the morning, they decided to skedaddle. I can't say I blame them. But that does seem to be the reason why those kind of entities will work that way. Your discarnate entity, that's your kind of ghost. Helen Creighton talks about one in Seabright. When he died, there was all kinds of paranormal activity happening in his house. I grew up just not far from there. One of his buddies said, "Oh, I know him. He'll want a drink." And it's in the Blue Nose Ghost story. They literally dug down, they drilled a hole in the coffin, poured some rum into it, and the manifestations stopped. Yep. Who knows? But sometimes that kind of thing can happen. The ghost of Half Moon Turn, which is actually the one that, thank you so much, darling, for that, which was a murdered female peddler who preceded Mr. Sode, the well-known peddler in the area here. She was murdered not too far from that area called Half Moon Turn, which is down by Leominster, about 15 miles just down the back road here. People would report seeing this mostly just ahead of a woman, sometimes appearing in their motor vehicles were starting to come in at that time, or in a horse cart, and people really tended to kind of put the gas down a bit when they went through Half Moon Turn. It got straightened in 1970 when they paved the road. I've not heard of any modern appearances of this person, but once again, people who do ghostly research figured this is an entity that is somewhat intelligent, and it may be that she was looking for justice over her murder because she never did. Nobody ever did get charged officially, but one of the suspects, after he died of natural causes, they were renovating his house in 1951 and found what was almost unquestionably her roll of money hidden in one of the walls. So. Third type of ghost, poltergeist, from the German rumble spirit. Sometimes people believe these are malevolent spirits on their own, but once again, if you get into the world of parapsychology, spit it out here, a lot of people believe it's not so much a ghost of a dead person, but that of a living person, usually an adolescent going through a very disturbed time, especially a girl. And a lot of poltergeist activity tends to be somebody who has had something very traumatic happening in their life, usually a younger person. An example of a ghost of the living was up near the New Russell area. I believe in the very late 60s, early 70s, a guy driving up the road saw a lady in her nightdress who he knew. And he stopped to pick her up, wondering what was going on. He knew her husband was very abusive. Obviously, we're not going to mention names. And so he was a little apprehensive even picking her up. But he said, I can't leave her here on the side of the road like this. Figured maybe she'd been running away from home. And she just vanished right in front of him. Wondering, had she died or something? He wasn't sure. And given the reputation of her husband, he didn't like to ask him. Well, he soon found out that, no, she was perfectly alive and well. Who knows, maybe it was like her spirit was trying to make a run for freedom down the road while her body was being abused. We don't know. And because of the tragic history of family violence, the man, it remained a mystery. He never did get to find out. Another question I sometimes get, if we can get this rather spooky computer to work, can objects be haunted? As an antique dealer, I will say sometimes you see something, if it doesn't feel right, if I really don't like the feel of something, certainly might not bring it in the house. But as I put there, don't become paranoid or obsessive. I've known people who can become extremely paranoid about that kind of thing. There are stories of haunted objects, but they're not super common. The Hope Diamond. Now, you can go on to Google, you'll see a whole bunch of stuff debunking the Hope Diamond, but they'll debunk just about anything. Sometimes I find with the world of the debunker, some of them, it's not that they require proof, but they just simply will not accept anything to be proof. Other people are too quick to jump to the paranormal as an explanation. It's hard to say. And by the way, speaking of my paranormal ability to go over time, if I start getting late, let me know. But certainly there are a long story of suicides, murders, and tragedies of people who owned the Hope Diamond, and it's now in the Smithsonian. Dora Mae Wegers, who was with the famous bluegrass group, the Coon Creek Girls, in the 1930s, had a banjo. She only died in the 1980s, and she would claim that this banjo was haunted, not in a particularly spooky way, but she would feel her hands being moved around on it, and it was a huge aid to her playing. I don't have any instruments like that. If I get a chance, it'll be great. And I mentioned very briefly there the James Dean car. There's a lot of stories about that. But certainly the story of Alec Guinness wouldn't ride in it. That one is absolutely verified.